Good evening. If you've ever been here for a while, or if you've sat in this section, then you know that this is like children Chernobyl. So like when Parker took off, yes, that was my daughter. It was like, it's a public safety risk. Anyway, she's probably fine now, I think. She's with Miss Amanda, so she's happy. But thank you for understanding with all the families that we have here and all the kids that are here to learn. That's a good sign when we have kids, right? I'm just explaining away my own daughter, really. But overall, it's a really good thing that we have a lot of kids here, and we're thankful for our families and their commitment to being here and to learn. So turn your Bible to Joshua 8, where we'll be here this evening. Also, if you've been here for a little while, even for 2 months, you know that we've been doing a textual study of the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua is very long, 20-something chapters, and plenty of material, pretty dense material to get through. But as we've said before, and as I'll reiterate tonight as we get into it, that the benefit of this is it helps us to be able to tackle together, all together, a lot of the things that we may not have the chance to tackle, these subjects, these events, that we might avoid sometimes. Some things that are either boring, some things that are difficult, some things that just we don't prefer to talk about. I don't know if you're like me, but we kind of, not that this is a bad thing, this is just our nature, right? Sometimes we prefer different genres in the Bible, right? You may be somebody who prefers poetry. You love reading the Psalms. You may be very connected to the Psalms. You feel strongly that is the way that God speaks to you. Understandable. You may really like history, and this is going great for you, right? You love how, and that's kind of how I am sometimes. I relate to a lot of these, but I love thinking about and seeing how the scriptures literally, physically played out in the history that we know, right? I don't know if you're like me, but sometimes we get this idea that like the Bible history, the Bible stories are separate from world history that we learn. They're intricately connected. These events literally happened, and there's, as we'll see a little bit later, I'll mention there is archaeological, physical evidence in Canaan that this happened. That's pretty cool to me, because again, we hear all these stories about the Canaanites, or we hear about Assyria or Babylon being these world powers back in school, or you read about these things. This was happening the same time in a different area, in a different way. But the thing that differentiates them is that Yahweh, the one true and living God, was with these people, and only these people, which is kind of cool. Which also means that we very much more need to study and look at these stories than even world history books which again, I love that. That's pretty cool to me. I like seeing how the Roman Empire developed, and the Greeks, and all the way back to Assyria and all these things. Those are cool. But this is distinctly what God wants us to remember. The other cool thing about this, in terms of like actual history, is that the books of the Bible that contain history of Israel, it is intricate, deep, detailed history about this people. Not a lot of nations have a history book that is so detailed, so accurate. What's really cool, again, based on archaeology and all the things that we can learn about other world history, about the other nations, is that there are certain events in Israel's history that come up in other nations. For instance, Babylon has some mentions of the people of Israel, or of the Jews, the Hebrews. Another nation, the Egyptians, mention it, not in a very kind way, as you would imagine, because they were overtaken by Israel, the one true living God, Yahweh. So that's interesting to me, and I love that. But we get a really cool in-depth view of what these things actually, how they played out. What actually happened, how they played out, the people involved, the number of people involved, right? This is really cool. So today in Joshua chapter 8, as we progress through this story, we're going to be talking about right after the events happened at Jericho, we get to Ai, right? And we talked about that some in the past couple weeks as well. There was already, in the last chapter, I guess we talked about this 2 weeks ago, Israel has already tried to overtake Ai. And then, again, they're going to come back in chapter 8, and they're connected. These stories, it's the same place, same people, different battle. and it's going to be interesting how those play into each other. I think here we go. I showed this back at our introduction to this. That is very zoomed out, and I anticipated that, so I brought a zoomed in version. Boom, that worked out great. So just to give you some perspective here, it's to remind you of where we are in the world, right? I'm assuming you can imagine kind of where this is. Dead Sea, Sea of Galilee, this is the land of Canaan, the promised land, right? Every time in the Bible when God talks about, when Abraham talks about the land of Canaan, the promised land, also goes by Palestine near Jesus' time is when it developed that name. That's this area, Sea of Galilee, Dead Sea. Off to the west is the Mediterranean Sea. You got Egypt over there just a little bit southwest, and that kind of puts that in perspective. And we've shown that already before at the beginning to kind of know where we're looking at, but here's a zoomed in version of specifically the events of what we're going to talk about here in Joshua chapter 8. The things that happened in the battle of Israel and Ai. And again, talked about this in chapter 7 some, and we're going to get into exactly kind of how they got to where they are now and what they did once they got there. I don't know if you're like me, but I've always loved the maps in the back of my Bible because it helps me place this, like I said before, to place it in reality. To be able to see this is a place on earth you could visit today. It'll look different. There's buildings there that weren't there before, and there are buildings that were there before that aren't there anymore. But this is a real place, real thing that happened. Paul's missionary journeys are probably in your back of your Bible. I'm sad because my current Bible doesn't have those, so I got to resort to looking at them online. But this places it in reality, somewhere that really exists and something that really happened. So if you've got your Bible open to Joshua chapter 8, we're going to kind of start back at Jericho and again work back towards chapter 8 that we're about to talk about and give a little bit of the leading up to this. So you remember that Jericho was defeated, right? That's the big thing. That's the big start of the conquest of Canaan, as it's called when we study it typically. That's the thing that kind of started it. Israel crossed over with the leadership of Joshua. They crossed over the Jordan River, which is right there. You can see that one right where it starts at Adam. Goes down, that's the Jordan River. They cross over, and that's what they would kind of define and mark as they have entered the promised land. That's kind of the defining geographical feature that determines they're in the promised land. That's a big moment, right? We talked about that a couple weeks ago. It's a big moment that happened. Joshua continues to lead them. Then they go across even more west to Jericho. At Jericho, again, we've studied this 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, where they walk around the city. It falls down. They blow the trumpets. It falls down. This is at God's hand, right? Do city walls just fall for no reason? No. It's God's hand. God, the God of Israel, the true and living God, is with them this whole time. And it's interesting, as we'll see it in the wording a little bit later, especially in chapter 7, I don't know if you remember when Jericho fell, it says that all of the other nations around, and even the people of Jericho, heard about the God that was with Israel. It says, to quote, their hearts melted within them. Do you remember that? I find that to be a pretty cool image of what that was really like. They were so terrified of what might happen because of the real power that they heard about from the God of Israel. They were so terrified their hearts melted within them. Well, interestingly, when Israel fails at their next conquest at Ai, after Jericho, they fail at that, and they were so scared that their hearts melted within them. So it's kind of interesting. That's a common way that the Bible describes that type of fear, especially when it comes to battle. But that first time that they go to Ai, they fail in their battle. And God knew they were going to fail. They failed because of the sin of Achan, right? He didn't do what God told them to do. God gave them very clear instructions to wipe out the whole place. And they didn't do that. They wiped out everything, but this guy named Achan took some of the spoils for himself. He was being selfish. He wanted riches for himself. He wanted to add to his possessions, whatever you want to call it. And that did not go well. So then God tells Joshua to take men to fight Ai. Now, God, knowing what was going to happen, tells him to not take everybody. And he only takes a smaller group of those soldiers. They go, they're defeated, and 36 of the Israelite men are killed because God was not with them in this fight. They were far from God. They hadn't listened to God. They hadn't obeyed God. They were far from him. Their relationship had been broken, and they suffered because of it. Because it was only by the hand that God was actually carrying them through and winning these battles in the first place. So when they try to do it on their own, it doesn't work. So that's where we come to this story in chapter 8. They've already tried to fight these people one time, and they lost. Which makes it really interesting when you realize that God musters them up again, talks to Joshua, and says, I want you to go try again. Well, it doesn't matter if it's 3 or 36 or 300 or 3,000. Losing men in battle any time is devastating, right? So the fact that before they had lost 36 men, you wonder how much worse is it going to be now if we go fight these people and we lose? Well, it's interesting. At the end of chapter 7, after they had mended the situation with Achan, it says that the Lord turned from his burning anger, and he relented from what he was doing. But because of that, he's back with the people of Israel in chapter 8. So the Lord said to Joshua in chapter 8, verse 1, do not fear and do not be dismayed. Take all the fighting men with you. Again, as opposed to a smaller number as last time. Take all of the fighting men with you and arise and go to Ai. See that I have given into your hand the king of Ai, and his people, and his city, and his land. You shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king. Only its spoil and its livestock you shall take as plunder for yourselves. So the command is a little different this time, to take the livestock for themselves, right? They need to eat. This is going to help grow their kingdom, but because of their obedience this time, God gives them a different command. And then Joshua, in verse 3, took all of those fighting men and arose to go up to Ai. He chose 30,000 mighty men of valor and sent them out by night, but he commanded them. This is where it gets interesting. This is a very strategic plan that's going to happen here with the battle of Ai. This isn't like God just told them, hey, run up against them and just go charging into battle without a plan. What they're going to do is, Joshua's going to, at the command of God, right? This wasn't even from Joshua's mind. Joshua may have been a great general. That's possible, but this is from the mind of God. God told him to take 2 separate groups, to have one set an ambush outside the city, and to have one group go up against the people of Ai, and then once the battle got started, to at some point draw back. And the Bible actually says, I don't know if I knew that this word was in the Bible, but it says in the ESV in verse 15, Joshua and all Israel pretended to be beaten. So this was a trap. They pretended to be beaten, and just like they had done the first time, they skedaddled out of there. They left as fast as they could. They retreated. But their plan was to retreat back towards the ambush that they had set. And then those people who were at ambush could either help them to defeat the people of Ai, or what they're going to do later is go into the city and overtake it. Because what happens later is all of the men of Ai and Bethel left to go pursue the Israelites when they left the town. It's just a very strategic plan. And plot twist, it works. Not plot twist, but spoiler alert, it works. So the people are going to flee. Those people are going to go in and overtake the city. And the 25,000 that are outside of the city are going to take care of the rest. So again, this is a very strategic plan. Has anybody ever played Risk? Yeah, maybe, okay, got a couple. I like Risk, the game. And there's another game, Stratego. I just think military games are kind of cool because it kind of lets you imagine and try to think, what would I do in this situation? This is the game of Risk, if you've never played, is you're trying to conquer the world, right? You have a certain number of soldiers and army, and your plan is to start wherever you're allowed to start on the board, and then you're going to progressively take over and win battles and take over the world. But it obviously takes a lot of strategy, right? Because you have to think about what's going to happen if I move into this place and then I move over here. And so again, that just kind of helps me picture what it's like. That the children of Israel are going into the land of Canaan, and they're not just willy-nilly going around doing whatever they feel like. God has promised them this land. And because God has promised them this land, God has a plan for how they're going to overtake this land. I mean, if we can go back a couple, that's the really zoomed out version. But even here, I mean, how many different cities do you see listed just on this small map? I mean, this is probably only maybe 30 miles wide in just this view that you're looking at. How many cities are there? And these nomadic people that don't have a home are just going to start taking over all of these cities? Does that make any sense? It doesn't. It would be very difficult for even the strongest warriors, strongest nations. Some did it, the Romans, the Greeks. But for this small group of nomadic people, it's not very good chances. So God has a plan. And as he says in chapter 8, verse 10, Joshua arose early in the morning and mustered the people and went up, and he and the elders of Israel before the people to Ai. All the fighting men who were with him went up and drew near before the city and encamped on the north side of Ai. So they're going to camp on the north side. Again, this is where the Bible gives us lots of details about how this took place. And again, maybe it's just if you're a guy, this is interesting to you. Maybe other people find this interesting too. I'm not sure. But they camped on the north side of Ai. There's a ravine between them and Ai. So what's interesting that I've noticed, you can look right here that the two teams kind of go in different directions. There's one team that's an ambush that's going to go this south way. They're going to follow this little river. It's called a wadi. That's what that W stands for, I believe. A wadi is just a ravine that fills with water when there's enough rain. So it's not always there. It's not a full river, but it is there sometimes. So they're going to follow along this bottom section. The other team is going to go this way, following another wadi that again the Bible describes as a ravine. So they're going to sit on this side, and between them is that wadi with a ravine between them and Ai. That gives them a little bit of safety. Joshua spent that night in the valley, verse 13 says. As soon as the king of Ai saw this, verse 14, he and his people, the men of the city, hurried out and went out early to the appointed place toward the Arabah to meet Israel in battle. But he did not know that there was an ambush against him behind the city. So again, remember, Israel is camped right about here. The ambush is over here. So the people of Israel are sitting somewhere on the west side of Ai. So that when they go out to battle on the east side, the ambush is going to come in from the other side and be untouched. It's a pretty smart plan. So in verse 14, he did not know that there was an ambush against him behind the city, and Joshua and all Israel in the fight, right there, pretended to be beaten before them and fled in the direction of the wilderness. They fled out this way. Fled in the direction of the wilderness. So all the people who were in the city were called together to pursue them. And as they pursued Joshua, they were drawn away from the city. Not a man was left in Ai or Bethel. They got a little help from a town right next door. There was no men left in either of these two cities. They were unguarded. They left the city open and pursued Israel. Then the Lord said to Joshua, verse 18, stretch out the javelin that's in your hand toward Ai, for I will give it into your hand. Joshua stretched out the javelin that was in his hand toward the city. This is kind of reminiscent of Moses, right? Can I see a little bit of parallels there? Moses stretched out his staff over the Red Sea to part it. So that's pretty interesting. So he holds a javelin toward the city. And the men in the ambush rose quickly out of their place. As soon as he had stretched out his hand, they ran and entered the city and captured it. And they hurried to the city and set it on fire. So when the men of Ai looked back, in verse 20, behold, the smoke of the city went up to heaven, and they had no power to flee this way or that, for the people who fled into the wilderness turned back against the pursuers. When Joshua and all Israel saw that the ambush had captured the city and the smoke went up, they turned back and struck down the men of Ai. And the others came out from the city against them, and they were in the midst of Israel, some on this side and some on that. Israel struck them down until there was no one left that survived or escaped. But the king of Ai they took alive and brought him near to Joshua. So again, what's pretty interesting about the way that this happens in, again, real time, in real history, in a real place, archaeological evidence supports the fact that these two places exist. It's stronger evidence that we know of that Bethel existed. And it's supposed that maybe Ai was a military outpost of the town of Bethel, basically. So they were sister cities. They were maybe a military outpost. And it's also been pretty well confirmed and documented through archaeology and study that both of these places were actually leveled and set on fire during the time period of the conquest that this would have happened. So again, pretty strong evidence when you look at physical supporting evidence that somebody leveled these two cities. And I would imagine that the best case of that would be the historically documented version of it right here that we have. It's pretty well defined. And I would also believe that if anybody, the God of Israel, the living, true and living God, would have been the one capable of doing that. So that's pretty interesting. The other cool thing about these two battles is that they're significant, because if we zoom back out to the bigger picture, this is, again, still kind of a cropped-in view. This is most of the Promised Land. But if they're right here in the middle, obviously that was a strategic move coming in from the side. But they've got a lot of area to take control of, to be a pretty small nomadic people. But what this did was, this gave them a spot in the mountains in the central area that they need to capture. So the goal was they're going to capture this spot right in the middle, and then they're going to expand out and conquer more. Right, there we go further into Joshua, and we're going to read about and see how they continued and finished the conquest. There's some areas that they left unfinished, and that's not good. We're going to see how that affects them and plays out later. But they were supposed to go from this spot and take the rest of the land. I had a quote from a professor. I might have said this before to you, but one of my most respected professors, I loved him so much. His name was Dr. Jim Gardner at Freed-Hardeman. He said something to the effect of, I never wrote it down or caught it on, recording or anything, but he said something to the effect of, why would anybody make anything up? Because life is too interesting, right? I kind of feel that way. I don't know if you're like me when you read stories or read books or anything. I'm a nonfiction kind of guy. That's terrible of me, I'm sorry to any readers out here. I'm a nonfiction guy. I don't really love just reading random stories. I like watching movies, so maybe I'm just a bad reader. But I don't really like reading, fiction, made up stories. But that's what he said. He was like, why would anybody even feel the need to make anything up? Just life itself is interesting enough. If you talk to enough people, I know when I've talked to my grandparents about their family history, you can find some wild stuff that's happened in your family. You're all probably looking at each other like, yep, I know, I've heard something, right? There's some wild things that happen in real life. And again, this feels like one of those things. A lot of what happens in Israel's early history feels that way to me. A lot of it's not good stuff, right? There's plenty of things that happen that are very bad. They're a stain on Israel's history. For instance, can you imagine being Achan, having done that, or being Achan's family, having done something that you thought was very insignificant, and turns out to be a punishment from God and an indictment on the entire nation of Israel, right? That's a pretty big deal that kind of affects everyone's life. But a lot of the things that happen in Israel's history are that way. But even some of the things that are interesting and good, including the fall of Ai. There's a couple of things, though, I want to notice. Sorry, I'm about to cough. A couple of things I want to notice about this story that are important to keep in mind. And we'll encounter this some more, but I think this is a really good chance to hit it head on. It's impossible to read stories like this in the Bible that speak of a complete and utter destruction of an entire city and people, and it might be easy to get comfortable as Christians because we have faith in God, right? We know his promises. We know what he's capable of doing. We know his plan. But there's people out there who really struggle, and there might be people in this room. I'm not saying this is not your struggle. Those last couple verses that we read, that Israel struck them down until there was left no one that survived or escaped. Does that hit you as hard as it does to me sometimes? I mean, we're talking about an actual event that happened that changed an entire town, entire part of this country, killed so many people. It says in verse 25, all the people who fell that day, both men and women, were 12,000. All the people of Ai. And again, I say this because there are plenty of people out there who really struggle with the idea of, and of course they label it genocide, right? How can a good and loving God instruct his people to go out and do something like this to an entire nation, to a city, to wipe them off the face of the planet? I'll also go ahead and say this, not sure about the children, right? This story particularly doesn't mention children, so we may just not know. But that's a very real and heavy thing to ponder, that this actually happened. And so a lot of people wonder, as we do sometimes, how do we interpret this event that happened in light of a God who just told us back in Exodus 34 that he's a God merciful and gracious? He's slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. How could he cause Israel to act in this way? And again, I say this because if we don't address it, we're going to have a lot of different opinions that come out from just tons of different people, and we want to address it biblically and truly for us as well as other people. How do we address this issue where God instructed the children of Israel to kill inhabitants of entire cities? The first reason would be that God has the ability to execute sovereign judgment, right? So the first issue is that you look all through, again, world history, Israel's history, and can somebody give me a water? I'm sorry. I hate to be that way. Thank you. This happened a lot like last year, and I just thought it wasn't a big deal anymore. So the first issue is that God has the ability and the right to execute judgment, right? So if you look throughout all of Israel's history, you look at, and not just Israel, world history. You go back from Adam to Moses, or Adam to Noah, I'm sorry, from Noah, then to Moses eventually. Basically, there's a story at some point where God tells whoever his leader is at the moment that the world is exceedingly wicked. Remember that that's the reason that the flood happened. Okay, God made the earth perfect. People messed it up. And then there has to be something done about it. Because if you think about the flood, if God just lets these people continue in wickedness, what does that do for anybody? It continues to make the world spiral down into worse and worse situations. No one is righteous, right? It continues to be worse and worse. And so judgment is not only for God to be holy and for God to be sovereign and to be correct in his judgments, but it's also for the benefit of the people existing on the world, actually. Have you thought about that? That's one thing that I think about a lot. And so it helps them to those that are doing right to stay holy. And again, you think about the situation of all these different people, they have had an opportunity to serve the true God. One of the other things that I have a hard time understanding is when you have a situation like Adam and Eve in the garden, how do people on earth, not saying we wouldn't do the same thing, but how do people on earth go from living and walking in the garden with God to creating false idols and making up these random gods that don't exist? Right? And how do you even do that? If somebody at some point has known and seen the living God, how does somebody just go, you know what? I've heard about the one that actually acts on this world and created this world, and it was Adam and Eve, our grandfathers, great fathers. Like, heard about him, but I want my crops to grow a little bit more, so I'm going to make an idol out of bronze. Like, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But they've had their chance, right? Same as today. Romans says that everybody has an opportunity throughout the creation to know that there is a God. They've taken their chance to either follow him or not, and they've chosen to not for whatever reason. So they're being judged. Wickedness increased on the earth at all times, and again, that's for their for everyone's benefit. The same way that we seek justice today for people who do wrong. But again, ultimately, I'm reminded that it's God's decision about the fate of all people, right? Romans 9, talking about God's sovereign choice, he says that God will have mercy on whom he wills, and he'll harden who he wills. God, just like we talk about this all the time with our money, right? Our money is already God's, so we're just giving back to God. I mean, do we believe and trust enough that we are created by God, therefore our life is also in his hands? Another thing I think about is we act, I think, a lot of times like death is the worst possible outcome ever. And to be fair, that is, in our finite perspective, we don't have a concept of infinity, of eternity. So for us, that is about the worst thing we can imagine, because that would end our reality that we know of. But something I'll also suggest is that we have to remember that while that seems like the worst thing to us, in the grand scheme of God's eternal, everlasting plan, the ending of our time here on earth is nothing to God, for lack of a better way to say that, if that makes sense to you as it does to me. That there are far worse things that he could imagine than our death, to be completely frank, right? What's more important than our physical living health? Our spiritual health, our relationship with him. So that doesn't necessarily take precedent. So someone's physical life doesn't necessarily take precedent over their spiritual health. So God has the ability to do what he wants with us. That takes a lot of faith, though. And again, I say that to acknowledge that, to make sure we're saying things like that, because this is hard for somebody who doesn't grow up in a church environment to think about, or even some that haven't encountered this before. But I'll read what Romans 9, verse 20 through 24 says. Romans 9, 20 through 24. Who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to make me out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use? This is important. What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, in order to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory, even us whom he has called, not from the Jews only, but from the Gentiles. So again, I say this takes a lot of faith, right? To acknowledge that God has the ability and the sovereignty and the choice to do with us what he wills. Maybe it'll help. I don't know. Thank you. This takes a great measure of faith. I'll be indebted to Josh forever if this works. And you will be too. But regardless of how long it takes us to wrap our heads around something like this, I can trust God because of what these events produce. Let me explain. The reason that God commanded this to happen, was so that Israel could take a hold of this nation and of this area of the world. And that from that situation, a king named David would take control of the throne of Israel and be a king like no other Canaanite nation had ever seen. And then somebody like Solomon would come onto the scene and have great riches like nobody had ever seen in Canaan before. And then from that same bloodline would come somebody named Jesus, who would be born, can't see it in that one, right about there, in this same plot of land that would actually be able to affect the spiritual welfare of everyone in all nations forever. So again, it's easy to get wrapped up in the difficulty of a passage like this, but it's a little easier to understand when we think about it in God's grand, perfect plan. And that's what helps me. What's really cool, too, as we close out, is to think about what the people of Israel and Joshua do with this event in Joshua chapter 8, 30 through 35. After this had happened, and they recognized that this was a great victory that they gained from the Lord, what do they do right after? Well, Joshua thinks back to his predecessor, Moses. And he thinks back to find a way to celebrate to God. Thinks back to a way to give him credit for what he has done because God gave them this victory. And what he did was, in verse 30, Joshua built an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, at Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of God, had commanded the people of Israel. Just as it's written in the book of the law of Moses, to do an altar of uncut stones. And they offered on it burnt offerings to the Lord. And then beyond that, so Joshua obeyed the law of Moses in providing sacrifice, to thank God, to worship God. Have you noticed that's a theme in Scripture, and especially in the Old Testament? They did it so well. Every time there was a victory that could be attributed to God, and even sometimes when they didn't know where it came from, they attribute it to God and they worship. Do we just bust out into worship sometimes? Should we? Right? When we recognize in our personal life that God has worked for us, it's fair to give God credit and to worship him. They did this just right here. I don't think they waited till Sunday or Wednesday. They just did it. They personally worship God. The other cool thing is Joshua read the whole law of Moses. So what your heading may say is Joshua renews the covenant. That's a cool way to put this. Joshua renews the covenant that Moses had established between Israel and God. And after this time, Joshua thought this a good chance to renew their commitment to God. It's a good time because they can remember in their mind something that God has done for them. Right? A covenant is between two people, and they have each a job to do. Right? God is constantly fulfilling his promises. And they have the option to hold up their end of faithfulness as well. This is a great time to do this. The third cool thing that he does here is he rewrites the law of Moses on tablets again, on stones. Just like God had given those to Moses, he continues to pass on the law and the commandments of God to the next generations. And again, this is one of the things to me in Joshua and in the Old Testament a lot that's really encouraging to me. They just, and Jewish culture that God created through these laws and tabernacles and feasts and everything, is that he encouraged them to do things like this, to remember what God has done, to renew the covenants that God has made. Because what that does is it keeps it on our mind, right? We forget. We talk about this a lot with the Lord's Supper. That's our feast for Christians. We need that because we're forgetful people. But there's so many other chances we have to remember God and to renew our covenant with God, right? And that doesn't mean we have to come forward during a formal invitation every week when we feel like we've done something wrong and we need, I'm not saying that's not a good thing to do, but I'm saying renewing your covenant with God can be a mindset that you continually do, a way that you personally dedicate your actions to God. That we've all made that commitment at one point to be baptized, to receive his grace, but we have more chances to remember what he's done for us. And again, I just say, I think that's a really cool thing that Joshua and the Old Testament does really well, that we could learn from. So I'll ask you tonight as we close, do you renew your covenant with God when it's needed? When you've forgotten, or when you've sinned, or when you've fallen into to being away from him? Do you renew your covenant with God? Do you remember? We talked about in the young adult class today, and I was thinking about this again, that we can be reminded of the commitment we made at first. Then that can help hold us accountable, right? To each other. We've all been baptized at one point, and we can have an opportunity to look at our brother or sister and say, do you remember the commitment that you made to God? And hold each other accountable to that. This is the same kind of thing. Can we renew our covenant with God to remember him, what he's done, and to praise and worship him because of those things? What this did, though, for Israel, and the benefit it can also have for us is, the benefit it had was refocusing them on what the plan was. So again, we're talking about the tactical side of this, the strategic whatever. What it did for Israel was it reminded them of their plan and what they were trying to do. They'd been given the law a long time ago. They needed to be reminded of where they were going and how they were going to do it. I was reading a book about just church systems and how we interact with each other. Kind of some psychology stuff behind how we interact. And it kept saying over and over that when people have a clear goal, they are less anxious. That's just a general principle. When we are sure of where we are going and how we're going to get there, we aren't anxious about what might happen, right? So for Israel, right here, they were reminded of the goal and how they were going to get there, and that allowed them to be less anxious in the way that they went about their battles and the way that they lived their life, because they knew God had promised the promised land to them, and that if they will just keep going, God has promised the outcome already. And I just don't know of a better way to flip that to be an application in our life, but to say the exact same thing. That if we can remember what God has done for us in the past, and we can be renewed in our covenant with him to know that he has fulfilled his promises in the past, he's given us a clear goal to look forward to keep working towards, he's going to keep fulfilling his promises and get us there at some point. And so I just want to challenge us to do that, to renew our covenant and to be with God, to worship him for what he's done, and that he's going to hold up his end of that covenant. If you need to use that same phrasing, to renew that covenant tonight, we do have an invitation song. I was just knocking it a second ago, but I'll bring it back. Not knocking it because it's a really good principle. It's one of the things that we do every week. If you've never thought about why we do it, it's an invitation to be restored. That's what we say. To be restored to Christ, restored to that relationship. And if there's any way that you need restoration tonight, whether that's to repent or to ask for the prayers of the church, that's a chance to do that now. And somebody will be with you. We can pray with you, and we'd love to help you out in any way. If you need to, come forward now as we stand and sing.